He contacted Apple and sent Steve Jobs an email. After a month, Steve Jobs sent an email back, said, "You got time to chat?" And got on the phone with him. Steve said, basically, this only makes sense if we buy the company. So the company was acquired really before it got started, within 5 months of their fundraising process. Threw away $60 million and are putting this technology on the shelf. $60 million, it seems like a lot of money to you and me, but at the time, they were probably a $2.5 billion company. Over 10 years, that's a pretty small insurance policy. If you believe that this was the best team in the world to take this technology to market, and you bet on them, and you don't think it was good enough, you cut your losses and you move on. And when I got there, it felt like, as you mentioned, a $2.3 billion company. That was valuation, by the way. Not, they had raised, somewhere north of 250 million in 4 years. So it was a unicorn in 2 years, billion-dollar valuation. It was over $2 billion in valuation in 4 years. I got there and there were 800 people working at the company. I remember thinking, like, what do those 500 people do over there? I have no idea. It was a company that grew way too quickly.
His guest was most notably the CEO of a company called Asset Performance Technologies, APT, which was a few years ago acquired by another company, a $2.3 billion tech giant called Uptake, that was founded by the founders of Groupon. They were acquired for over 8 figures, and Mark was the CEO at the time. He's also been an angel investor. He's invested in many companies, some successful, a lot of unsuccessful ones as well, which we'll get into. So without further ado, Mark, welcome to the Builders and Funders Show.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you having me, Burke. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Absolutely. I want to start with kind of your story around APT, getting involved with it. To my understanding, you founded a biomedical company before that, and then you got involved as a CEO. We'll get to the story of the 8-figure exit and what happened with APT, but let's talk about the start before that. Tell me about, I believe it was called InLight Solutions. Tell me about that. Mm-hmm. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, it's a good story, actually. I was minding my own business, living and working in Germany at the time. I had left Mercedes-Benz, was working at a university and theoretically working towards a PhD. And a buddy of mine from college called and said, "Hey, I got this idea for a company. I want you to be part of the team." He said, "You can come now as a co-founder, or you can come later when you're done with your PhD." And, I enjoyed academia, loved the research, loved the teaching, hated the politics, hated the fundraising. So I moved to Albuquerque to start this biomedical device company called InLight Solutions. And fortunately, the planets aligned well in terms of, there were publications, there were patents on the technology, and we got the attention of someone like Johnson & Johnson to fund us for at least 10 years. So that's how it got started. It was over here at the University of New Mexico at their medical school campus. We were in an old cinder block building, killing roaches in the mornings with liquid nitrogen and that sort of thing.
I think initially, the company evolved into different kind of factions or spin outs. I think one of your co-founders actually, the most successful spin out was sold to Apple, to Steve Jobs specifically. Your co-founder sold to Steve Jobs. Tell me about that story.
Well, actually, that probably wasn't the most successful one. And that wasn't technically a spin out, but it was one of our co-founders who he left the company after about 5 years. Personalities are important at the executive level in a company, and there were some disagreements. And he went off on his own, and he worked for every VC-backed non-invasive glucose monitor company on the planet, all of whom failed. And then one day, and this had to be 10, 15 years ago, he calls me and says, "Hey, I think I figured this out. I built a new device and collected some data in my garage." I'm like, "Well, send me your data." I was like, "Yeah, whatever. Send me your data. Let me take a look at it." And I took a look at his data. I said, "Well, this is actually pretty darn good for your garage." And so he founded a company, right? And it was just 2 people. It was him and a board chairman. And we made an investment, convertible debt investment, kind of an early stage. This is before, I guess we call them safe agreements now. This is before all that. And within 5 months, he got a call. He contacted Apple and sent Steve Jobs an email. This friend of mine's a big Apple fan. Bob Messerschmidt, huge Apple fan, was always the fanboy. The only guy with a Mac in our biomedical device company, the guy who had a Newton, when everybody else had Palm Pilots. But anyways, You probably don't remember any of these because they're way before your time. But long story short, you sent an email to Steve Jobs, and after a month, Steve Jobs sent an email back, said you got time to chat, and you got on the phone with him, and Steve said basically this only makes sense if we buy the company. And so the company was acquired really before it got started, within 5 months of their fundraising process, which was great for the founder and the board chairman. Those of us early investors on the convertible note, there's no provision for acquisition. So, but they were kind enough to pay us double our investment plus the interest. So I consider that more than a fair deal.
Mhm. I want to talk about one of the lessons that from that story. You mentioned that the partner in question left after like 5 years of working together, and you mentioned personality is important. Could you elaborate on that? What do you mean by personality is important?
Um, Look, and I can say this in a number of different levels, but when you get to the C-suite and or the board of a company, nonprofit, whatever, senior leadership level, you're there because you're competent, you're good at what you do. Everybody is, right? Um, but then it comes down to how do you gel as a team, and sometimes people disagree and don't handle those disagreements well, or have a different idea for the company, or want a different direction, and you say your piece, and you either come to some sort of compromise, or you leave and go find something else to do. You'll find that I had a mentor, it was from the early Inlight Solution days, who told me that too. He said, "Yeah, once you're at the C-suite and board level, it's all about the personalities." I hope that makes sense. You have to be able to work well as a team, and work together as a team to be successful.
I assume there's a degree of like you have to find other personality types, I guess, that you're compatible with, that you tend to get along with and don't tend to get along with. Is there a way where if you're someone young and you're thinking, okay, I've got this buddy of mine who wants to start a company with me, got this other buddy, is there a way to proactively before the crap hits the fan and disagreements start and you're about to lose a bunch of money or deals are falling through? Is there a way to proactively kind of weed out and say, you know what, this person's personality I might not get along with? Or is there like a test that you can run that you've picked up over the years?
Yeah, well, there are several, and there's a lot of newer assessments that I'm probably not as familiar with, that are relatively short, personality type assessments. And look, they're not black and white answers to whether or not you can gel as a team, but they sort of point out where the issues could potentially be. I mean, it starts with like the Myers Briggs personality test, and just understanding, what motivates people, how they make decisions. And I can't remember the names of some of the newer ones, but there's plenty of that. But the other thing I'd mention too, Burke, is, and I coach a lot of early stage entrepreneurs and people just generally looking for jobs, that you know it, what's important to the hiring process are really three things: competence, fit, and desire. Most everybody focuses on competence, right? Do I have the skills? Do you have the skills for the job I'm hiring for? Very few people think about fit. Would this person fit in the department, the team, the company, whatever it is? And even less probably think about, did the candidate actually show me desire for this position? And in my mind, you've got to be able to check the boxes in all three of those to have a good match. And I try to coach people on that, of like, hey, when you're in an interview, yeah, certainly answer the competence questions, but think about too, how you're a fit, and show your desire to work for that company.
Mhm.
That to me creates a better match in the hiring process. Does that help?
Yeah, so if you're looking for a potential co-founder, okay, competence, can they code, can they sell? Perhaps, okay, cool. They know how to do that. So how do you know if they're a fit, and how do you know if they have the desire to do it? What are some ways you can tell that?
Well, fit. It depends on the situation, right? But if you're looking for co-founders, get to know these people. Hang out with them a bit. Have coffee, have lunch, have dinner. Spend some quality time to decide. Is this somebody I'm ready to go to battle with, right? In my startup, is this somebody I would be comfortable staying up late at night working with? If not, then it's probably not a good fit. And the desire piece is, is this person communicating to you that they want to be a part of your team, a part of your business? Are they sharing the same passion that you might have for what you're trying to create? I mean, it's asking questions in those lines, and not making rash decisions. I mean, the old mantra is always hire slowly and fire quickly. Um, take your time in the hiring process to make sure it's a good match. And these processes aren't perfect, so if it's not a good match, don't let it go on. End it. you know, fire quickly.
Absolutely. You mentioned we talked a little bit about kind of the Steve Jobs, the company that was sold to Steve Jobs. That wasn't technically a spin out, but unfortunately, Johnson, I believe you mentioned, kind of shelved the startup that you guys were working on. But there was one spin out, one actual spin out that was successful and did go on to exit. I think there's an important story for those that aren't familiar with it on pivoting at the right time, and how if you just persist, you will eventually get to the answer. I'd love to talk about that story a little bit.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, you're dead on. So we Inlight Solutions, what started as Rio Grande Medical Technologies and became Inlight Solutions. We rebranded at some point for can't remember the reasons why. I don't know why people rebrand. It's usually a waste of money, but anyways, we rebranded. And after 10 years of developing, a device to measure glucose non-invasively with some successful measurement results, it wasn't perfect. We were ready to go to market. Johnson Johnson wasn't. They said it wasn't accurate enough. We had plenty of physicians and diabetics who said, we'd love to have this device. What nobody said out loud was, that company makes a lot of money by you pricking your finger and putting a drop of blood on a device. It's a pretty high margin business. And maybe they didn't want to, at that time, and this is over 20 years ago, cannibalize that business. But we had these monthly, and I'll get to the story here. We had these monthly research meetings, right? So the Johnson Johnson folks would fly in every month. We'd go to the auditorium. We'd have a big day long session of this is what we did, this is what we learned, this is what we're going to do next. And at that time, the biggest problem we were having, and it's still a problem for a non-invasive measurement, is you're trying to find the needle in the haystack. The haystack is your skin. The needle is this small molecule and signal called glucose. And so there's a lot of noise around the measurement that's not related to the glucose signal. It has to do not the color of your skin, but the chemical composition of your skin. Water, for example, is a huge absorber of light. So is collagen. So is fat. Lipids, things like that. There's a whole list of stuff that's a lot easier to measure than glucose. And we were talking about that. And these what we called at the time patient to patient differences, the fact that people look different in the near infrared spectrum of light. And and we were talking about our modeling strategies and our research and this kind of thing. And one of our board members, a guy named Bill Miller, who still lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, he raises his hand. And so Bill's a finance guy, right? He had commercialized the first CAT scan and sold it to Johnson and Johnson. So he was a good board member to have, but he's non-technical. He raised his hand. He was in the back of the room. I'm like, okay, what the heck is he asking about? He raised his hand. He says, hey guys, if that's your problem, this patient to patient difference thing, doesn't that mean you can measure, or you can distinguish people from each other? You can identify people? And you could just see our jaws drop. We've been so focused on measuring glucose, we hadn't even thought about the fact that we could ID people. So meeting ends, right? We run back to our computers, and me and my entire research team, we rerun the models. Instead of modeling glucose levels, we modeled patient IDs. Super accurate. We ran a bunch of studies where we brought in identical twins and we could distinguish them from each other using this technology. So we spun out a separate company that created a smaller, cheaper, faster device, which eventually exited to the Swedish lock maker, Assa Abloy, and their HID division in the US for high security biometric applications. That, from glucose to ID, biometrics.
I want to talk about the shelving of the company for a second. So something interesting I've noticed is, my first startup was in consumer, but eventually I moved on to B2B. And as I talked to other people who had built a lot of business to business companies that either relied on some big enterprise customer or had to deal with some big, massive behemoth like Johnson and Johnson. Something I realized was a lot of them had some similar story about how the company either killed their startup or almost killed their startup. So like I had a buddy who had a logistics company who, right before COVID, they sign on this big client and, this big enterprise customer, they say, well, we need you to get X amount of trucks to sign this deal. We're not going to give you the money up front. We'll do this in phases. So they had to go find a lender. They find the lender, and then COVID hits, contract gets canceled. Not only now do they have all these trucks that are sitting dormant, but they also have all this debt to pay off. Terrible situation, almost went bankrupt. They're still recovering. But in terms of, with the benefit of hindsight, if you're building a startup today, you're doing anything B2B, and whether it's biomedical where you have to deal with a big pharma, like a big pharmaceutical company like Johnson and Johnson, or any other industry where you're dealing with these massive enterprise customers, what are some maybe regrets you have about that period? How would you have gone better with working with some of these folks? Because I know there's a lot of members of the audience that might be building a B2B company where they're thinking, how the hell do I deal with these big companies? I don't know how to do this. I don't want them to kill my startup.
Well, it's particularly in the B2B spaces, you can't avoid it. I mean, right? Those are the customers and or partners. What I learned from that biomedical device experience is we had all our eggs in one basket. And that's how we set up the company. I mean, we took $60 million in non-dilutive funding for about 10 years from Johnson and Johnson. And in order for them to break the contract, they had to pay us it was like another million or two to break the contract. We picked our horse and it didn't pan out, right? That happens. You don't know that in advance. But I think the main lesson I learned, particularly when I got into industrial software, was, you get that first main customer and they're your big customer, but, they could cancel the contract anytime. And they do. Companies will do this for various reasons. I mean, companies will buy other companies and put it on the shelf just to take the competition out of the market, right? Stuff like this happens. You've got to be aware of the market dynamics, and more importantly, you've got to diversify your revenue streams. That's the most important thing you can do. Whether that's your funding stream or your revenue stream, however it is you're surviving and making payroll, that needs to be diverse. And if it's reliant on any one customer, partner, VC, or whatever, you're at risk, right? I'm not saying it's bad, but it can go south.
You mentioned you take $60 million in non-dilutive funding from Johnson & Johnson. If you could go back to those days, do you think you would have taken money from a few other kind of companies? Do you think you would have diversified immediately to make sure that the company can't get killed if one funding source is cut off?
I don't think so. I don't think we would have done anything differently because at that time we were courting all the big companies and they wouldn't work together. so you can do non-exclusive licensing deals. Depending on the situation, generally those types of companies don't want non-exclusivity. They don't want their competitors to have access to technology. They want to own it. They want exclusivity. But the good news is for the startup and the co-founders is if they want exclusivity, that's going to cost more, right? So I don't think we would have done anything different. And we picked it, and it was a good horse to ride. I think Johnson & Johnson was a good partner up until they made the decision not to move forward with the technology. And it seems crazy, right? Okay, they threw away $60 million and are putting this technology on the shelf. Well, actually, we got some of the rights back at some point. So it wasn't completely on the shelf, but they were not going to take it to market. And that was going to be their job. They were the go-to-market strategy, right? We were the developers of it. They were taking it to market. But $60 million, it seems like a lot of money to you and me. But at the time, they were probably a $2.5 billion company. Over 10 years, that's a pretty small insurance policy. If you believe that this was the best team in the world to take this technology to market, and you bet on them and you don't think it was good enough, you cut your losses and you move on. And to be honest, nobody else has actually brought this to market yet. So maybe they were right.
I want to move on to then you get involved in APT. Tell me about how that came about. How did you become the CEO, and why did you decide to kind of join Asset Performance Technologies?
I left the biomedical device company. For me, the writing was on the wall. This is before Johnson Johnson made its decision, but I sensed the decision was coming. And I had an opportunity to start a venture capital fund with a business partner locally to take technologies out of Sandia National Labs and create new companies. It never got off the ground, and there's a million reasons for that I won't bore you with. We could do a whole nother podcast episode on that topic. But a gentleman who became a good friend of mine and still is to this day had come to town to visit his parents on his motorcycle. And he saw, some press about our venture capital fund, and he contacted me. He said, "Hey, I'm a software entrepreneur, done some interesting things in my career, had a big exit, driving around the country on a motorcycle, visiting my parents in Albuquerque. Let's go meet and have drinks." And we hit it off very well after that first meeting. And we were kind of joking with each other. He said, "Well, I got this idea for a new startup." And I said, "Well, yeah, if this venture fund ever gets off the ground, look, I'll hire you if I get my venture fund going. You hire me if you get your company going." Well, the venture fund failed. And he said, "Well, hey, why don't you come work with me? We don't have any money. You could help me raise money locally. You could do some business development work." And that's how I got involved with what became APT. And after about a year or so of fundraising, at this time, this is probably 2004, 2005 timeframe, there was a lot of interest from the coastal VCs, but they wanted to move the company to the coast, right, to be in their backyard. That's less the thing now, but back then that was sort of the thing in the VC community. The founders, the two technical founders, in addition to my buddy Carlos Cashman, who was the initial CEO, they didn't really want to move the company. So we looked at some angel deals locally, and we just said, okay, let's bootstrap this off services revenue, because we were doing consulting work at the time. And at that point, Carlos decided to move back to Boston. He had gone to MIT and had a lot of connections there. And he moved back to Boston, and you should get him on your podcast. He's the most successful individual I probably know. He's been through multiple exits since that time, but he kind of left me in charge. And, I had to go out and figure out, okay, how do we build a business here? So we started with using software and data to provide services. And then that market dried up around 2008. And we pivoted to desktop software. And that sucked because every January 1st, we had to start from scratch and building our revenue streams. So several years later, we pivoted to SaaS when SaaS was an up and coming thing. And that's what we used to grow the revenues and sell the company.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then you mentioned, so you're building, you mentioned you're building APT, you're kind of left in charge. You're now the CEO. You pivot a few times. You're trying to find something that sticks, and you come across SaaS as it's starting up, and you were kind of the first one to ride that wave. Now, you've kind of seen SaaS develop over the years. You were kind of the OGs of B2B SaaS. Where do you think it's headed? I hear some investors say, well, B2B SaaS is dead. Next, it's vertical LLMs. All the low-hanging fruit have been picked. There's some that are saying this is the best business to be in. It's the gold rush. It's what you got to do. Where do you stand? Where do you see as the future of SaaS being headed to?
Well, to your point about AI and LLMs, I think that's what you said, right?
Yes,
if I heard you correctly.
vertical LLMs.
That is the future, and I think there's going to be success there, but it's also the hot space to be throwing money at. And not all the companies are going to succeed. There's going to be winners and losers, just like everything. And I kind of, there's a little bit of that gold rush mentality going on. And, in 1849, when the gold rush happened, there were a lot of miners who went bankrupt, right? Or ended up in poverty. Not everybody struck it rich. And I think that's going to be the same with AI and LLMs. I think there's a lot of potential there. And, just a quick side story, at APT, we were a small company from Albuquerque. We tried to partner with the big boys. The SAPs of the world, the IBM Maximos of the world, could barely get IBM's attention. And so I sold the company to Uptake. And then what was it, like 4 or 5 years later, they sold it to IBM Maximo. So IBM Maximo is now taking our software and our content library and creating LLMs out of it for a very specific application to improve industrial maintenance. But So, stranger things have happened. But your question about B2B SaaS, it is not. Maybe they think it's dead from an investment perspective, but I wouldn't say that. I mean, look, these are generally, if done right, the B2B SaaS deals are large deals and long term deals, and companies who are buying these products are spending a lot of money on them. And they want in perpetuity is probably, there's not an indefinite period, but they definitely want their return on investment over time. I mean, they want to see these products in the market for as long as they need them. And when you look at those types of large deals, I mean, those are hard to replace. It's hard to come in selling something else. If a company spent $10 million on a software package for several years, they're not going to replace it immediately with the latest, greatest thing. So that gives some longevity, I think, to the B2B SaaS space. Maybe the investors don't see it as like there's nothing new coming down the pipe. I don't know if I'd say that yet, but I think there's legs there.
Absolutely. You also, before we started recording, you mentioned that APT would have likely died with if it had received venture capital funding, it would probably wouldn't have made it. What did you mean by that?
It goes back to what you and I were talking about with persistence. Like if you believe you're creating something of value, I mean, there's probably is a point where every startup has to say, "Look, we can't, we can't make payroll. We got to shut the doors." But even when times are tight, if you believe that you've got something, you've got to stay persistent. Find the customer, find somebody who shares your opinion of value and is willing to write you a check for it, to pay you money for the product, and sees value to its business. I think what often happens, I've seen it happen locally, is things always take longer to develop the business than you think. And, some venture capitalists just aren't patient, don't see that persistence. And, it's not right or wrong. It's just how they're managing their portfolio. They make a decision. This happened with a number of our spinouts from the biomedical device company. They were at various stages of getting ready to go to market or FDA or something. And the venture capitalists could say, you know what, we've had a successful fund to date. We're not willing to risk more capital on this. We're going to shut it down. Not because it was a bad idea, not because it couldn't be successful. It just didn't fit with our portfolio. So if you can't get your sales going quickly or these other kind of fund management issues come up, that's sometimes when you get shut down. And since we didn't have venture capital investment in APT, we bootstrapped it off our services revenue. We were able to, ride out the storm, the 2008, 2009 storm, for example, and develop a successful business that we could then sell to Uptake.
So now that you're kind of on the other side of writing checks, although you don't necessarily have like a venture capital fund, you're still an angel investor. Where do you stand when it comes to like, you bootstrapped APT and there are many benefits to that. Yes, maybe it took a bit longer, but like you didn't have the external pressure of you have to get this going, you have to get this. You could have that soul searching phase and really find something that resonated with the market. If you're building today, would you kind of, I know one-off rounds have started to become popular where they just, founders raise a small, make usually angel round and they take all the capital they need and that's it. They're not going to these bigger institutional investors. Where do you kind of see the future going and what would you do as a founder today?
Well, I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule, but it really depends on the business. I think what I learned, and this was a key learning from the industrial software business, is that industrial sales has a significant amount of inertia. I mean, these are long sales processes. Just think about it. Companies don't spend large sums of money that aren't budgeted for. And if you haven't contacted the company before its budget cycle, you're immediately next year. You have to wait a year. I mean, there's an inherent inertia in selling B2B, software. So you've got that working against you. And so as a result, how does that affect a company like APT? we were undercapitalized. We probably could have done better if we had the money to hire a sales team and really make this happen. But instead, we had to build that slowly. So, you know, I think I'd have to look at each situation and decide this is something you should raise money for because you're going to need the capital to scale, or no, can do this on your own because you don't need the capital. Remember, venture capital money, it's not to knock it, but it's the most expensive money on the planet, right? There's other ways to get funding. You know, backing up the waterfall or up the pipeline, whatever you want to call it, to angel investors, for example, and usually negotiate fairer deals, or look at non-dilutive sources of funding. A lot of the deep tech stuff that's going on in Mexico, it's like get your grants from the federal government and state and whatever to wring out some of the technology risk before you ask for venture capital money to scale and that sort of thing. Show me there's a market there before you start asking for the most expensive money on the planet. So that's how I think about it. It really depends on the business and what you're trying to achieve.
But it's kind of like I guess the good rule to follow, or at least the general rule, is like find some that resonates with the market, find some that you can sell and make money off of, and then as you start getting that traction, then consider taking the most expensive money in the world from the VCs. Am I kind of right in that kind of principle?
Yeah, I think so, and it also comes down to you as the founder, or you as the set of founders. What is it you want? Do you think you've got the idea of the century that can scale to a large consumer and or industrial exit? Or do you just want to earn a nice living and have your nights and weekends off and create a company it's not right or wrong. There's lifestyle businesses, and then there's like scaling technology businesses. You need to be honest with yourself. Are you willing to put the work in and give up some freedom, if you will, to go the venture route, or are you just looking to make a good living and provide for your employees and your family? And you got to be honest with yourself in this stuff.
I remember seeing the CNBC article about the acquisition of Uptake into APT, and you've got this 8-figure exit. You're supposed to be happy, but I think when we're talking, you actually weren't as happy as you thought it would be. It wasn't like sail off into the sunset, buy your island or whatever, and just hang out. It seemed like anything but that. Tell me about the realities of an exit like that, and maybe some of the regrets and lessons you learned during that period.
I think it came up in the discussion with a quick discussion we had before we were on camera about lessons learned. And I think in the acquisition process, we were so focused. I was so focused. My colleagues, the co-founders, were older and looking for their retirement, right? And so I was looking to make sure I got the exit done and really focused on providing all of the information about our company, everything they asked for, right? Which it's a lot, if I were to do it over again, I would start the startup with the exit in mind and make sure I had the information set up properly, the information system set up properly, so I didn't have to go digging for it later. I think that's probably a smart thing to do. Start the company with the exit in mind. But what we learned was we focused so much on answering their questions, we probably didn't ask enough questions of the acquirer. We had to beg them for financials, and they gave us kind of a simple P&L, which looked great. And at the time, we're like, wow, that looks, this company's high flying. At one point, the investment banker joked with me, said, we should take the whole deal in stock. I said, no, I can't do that. These guys need cash and to retire with and that sort of thing. But, our conversations on the ground with the leaders, parts of the leadership team were great. What I didn't realize is that I got there day one and most of the company had no idea about the acquisition. Secondly, they had hired some very capable people, but they were like B2C executives. They didn't fully understand B2B, let alone industrial sales. And, we got acquired at the peak and things kind of went downhill from there. So there were some important lessons learned.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned one of the first things you talk about was a lot of times when someone's looking to buy our company, they'll ask you a lot of questions, but very rarely will you ask them questions. And so you mentioned they gave you a P&L, but it was very simple, gave you only, a few data points. If you're maybe if you want an exit in the future, if you're a founder today and you're building something, you're thinking in a few years I want to get an exit, or you're at that stage where you've now got buyers coming to your door, what questions would you specifically ask them to try and gauge if it's the right deal?
I think I was so anxious because we've been working on the company had been around for like 14 years. I mean, this took a while. This was an overnight success that took 14 years, right? So we were anxious to get the company sold. So I wasn't thinking. I mean, what comes to mind is competence, fit, and desire. Um, you know, think about it in those terms. Does the company really appreciate what they're purchasing? Do they understand the technology? Do they see where it fits in? And I of course was selling them on those points, and it turns out certain individuals did understand that, but not the senior leadership. I found that out later. And was it a good fit? To this day, I still think it was a good fit to the company, but the company didn't really understand the business it was in. And that plays in a little bit to the desire piece. If the CEO and one senior salesperson are driving the acquisition, does the rest of the executive team support it? I mean, I found out later maybe that wasn't the case, and it wasn't necessarily the lack of support; it's just not understanding it. I spent the first week on the job educating people on what it was they bought. To me, that was surprising. I thought, wait a minute, you should know this already. So I would ask more questions along those lines. you know, Again, no, I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to somebody else about this today. But recruiting and hiring, acquisitions, raising money, those are all sales problems, right? You're selling. So you got to be able to weave a good story and sell the deal, whatever the deal might be. And I should have done a better job of that with this acquisition.
So it's kind of like you're selling this thing that you've been working on for the last 14 years. You obviously want to make sure that after the acquisition, although you're making your cash and you're happy, you still want to make sure the company succeeds and it's not completely, it's not killed or it's not managed improperly. You're still having a bunch of your staff transferred over. So you mentioned you
Right.
try and make sure that the entire executive, the senior team, they understand what they're buying, not just one or two people, but the entire team does. So what does that look like in practice? Are you going there and asking to speak to all the executives and building rapport with all of them and building relationships with all of them? Are you, or is that kind of what it would look like?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was. It was one-on-one meetings, building relationships, answering their questions, making sure if they didn't ask the right questions, is providing the information I thought they needed to understand how their department, their role in the business fit in with this acquisition. That was a lot of it. It was sort of eye opening to me, Um, uh, and it's not to knock Uptake either. I mean, the CEO and founder is brilliant. A guy named Brad Keywell. He's one of the co-founders of Groupon, and the other co-founder was on the board of Uptake. These are high-powered, highly successful people. I think, as I debrief it in my head, when I got there, it felt like, because you mentioned a $2.3 billion company. That was valuation, by the way. Not they had raised, I don't know, somewhere north of 250 million in 4 years. So it was a unicorn in 2 years, $1 billion valuation. It was over $2 billion in valuation in 4 years. I got there and there were 800 people working at the company. And, I remember thinking, like, what do those 500 people do over there? I have no idea. It was a company that grew way too quickly. And, I would say probably didn't have the systems and processes in place to really manage the company well at that point. And what goes up eventually falls down, right? You can say that about stocks. You can say that about startup companies. If they go up quickly, be real careful that they might fall too. Particularly in the stock market. You know.
That's there's that one saying. This is kind of a little. It's somewhat relevant. I think it's fast success builds ego, slow success builds character. I guess you could apply that to companies as well.
Totally, totally. I've heard versions of that over the years. That's a very good. That's one of those things I should write down myself. Yeah, like I've heard this from other successful entrepreneurs and venture capitalists that once you exit and you sell your company, all of a sudden you're a genius and everybody wants to talk to you, but you're the same person the day before. You knew as much 24 hours ago as you do now. It just so happens you got lucky and you sold your company. And I use that term luck and lucky intentionally. Yeah, there's certainly skill involved, and you need to have something that's of value. You need to find somebody who's willing to pay for it. You need to create a market for it. All those things, but there's a million reasons even if you do all the right things as a startup that you could fail. There's some luck involved with market dynamics, swinging your way. And I think it's important to not let it go to your head. Build the character, not the ego.
I had Jeff Relson on the show not too long ago. He was the former president of Y Combinator. But before that, I was talking to him about he had worked at Hewlett Packard and he had a relatively stable, nice career, right? And he decided to start businesses and he failed for the first few years and then got involved at 401, built Rocket Mail, but still even then had some regrets during those periods. But the things I asked him was like, how the hell did you maintain your conviction? Like things weren't going your way for a long time. I want to ask you that question as well because I think we glossed over this. But you mentioned you're building APT, you become the CEO, and for years and years, you guys are kind of like you find something and it kind of works, but then it doesn't, and then you keep playing this cat and mouse game. And I'm sure like you had a career before that. You're working in Germany, you have a career, you got a job, like you were comfortable, and now you're in this situation where you don't even know the decisions you're making are going to pay off. And obviously, you build it for 14 years and get the exit, but that was never obvious, I'm sure, to you. So how did you, like if you can take me back to that moment, it's maybe 2008 and you're realizing, oh man, we're, we keep playing this cat and mouse game and you don't know it's going to last 14 years. If you can take me to that moment, how are you maintaining that conviction? Were there just periods of like deep sorrow and depression, or what was happening during that period?
Oh, there were definitely the down years for sure. 2009 in particular was a very down year for us because we had some big services deals teed up and those got canceled with the global financial crisis. And we're like, oh, we don't have any revenue. How are we going to pay ourselves? And that's when we decided to pivot to becoming less of a services company and more of a software company. Um, there's again, I use the term, I can't remember if it's off camera, on camera now, persistence, or maybe you used it too. Again, if you believe in what you're doing, you find a way. And not only if you believe in what you're doing, but if you've got a family to feed, and you've got people working for you with families to feed, there's some pressure, to find a way to succeed. And that's kind of what we did at APT. We never would have thought it would have taken this long. Nobody thinks it's 14 years. They always think it's like, oh yeah, 2-3 years and we're gonna IPO or exit. Well, it never works that way, right? Talk to anybody. The company's been around a lot longer than when you heard about it IPOing on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever. But in our case, I think we believed and we had reason to believe that we had something of value. We just hadn't figured out how it fits in the market properly, and that product market fit, right? That we hear so much about, and it's super important. It's getting early customer feedback and understanding whether or not your offering has legs. And we were slow in that regard, I think. But we figured it out eventually. And combine that with a little bit of persistence and not willing to give up. And we were still young enough at the time, and hungry enough, if you will, to see this succeed. You mentioned you had a career and things like that. That's great, but career doesn't pay your bills now. When you're in a startup, you gotta find a way. As I always used to say, we got to eat what we kill. And that changes how you go about the business, right? You get up at a different time in the morning. You go to bed at a different time of night. You really focus your efforts on how do I grow sales.
Y-
Sales. See, just one more quick. My buddy Carlos and I always talk about this because we're involved in several other companies together, not only APT, and we always joke about like sales basically cures all problems. you know, if you're selling, it's usually you don't have too many other issues in the company.
the story you told about APT, it kind of reminds me of Pixar's story and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs had this quote about how while they were building Pixar, they knew they had something, they knew it could be something, but they just didn't know how it fit into the market. And he'd say, we'd all fall into depression, just not at the same time. So we could pick one another up, and we eventually did find a way. And Pixar, obviously, it contributed a great deal to Steve Jobs' legacy and success. But no, that's exactly what it reminds me of when you're talking about APT.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah. You can't all be down at the same time. That usually doesn't end well. You gotta, we would, things would be bad, and we would, take less salary. Do whatever you had to take to stretch things out, to stretch the runway out in the company. But we were fortunate enough that we'd get a piece of good news, and that would kind of fire us back up, or that's the Pixar story is a good one.
Who's the most notable founder or startup you've kind of come across that's pitched you? And the reason I ask that is because often it reveals how to talk to investors. It reveals a great lesson about success, how to successfully fundraise. So, in your experience, are there any founders or startups that really stood out to you with their story and their approach to you when they were kind of asking you to invest?
Yeah, there's generally, I mean, most of them, because that's what I look for, right? The VCs will tell you this too. You invest in the founder and the team. The idea is going to change, right? You know, generally, it's hard to predict in the early stages whether the widget is going to sell as is, or something needs to change, or markets will change, and that sort of thing. And I got so many stories about that, but I tell you, the most notable one was my buddy Carlos. His last company, he was kind enough to come to me and pitch me on the startup as getting in at with the friends, family, and fools round, if you want to call it that, but the early capital round. And the idea was to buy up companies, small mom and pop shops that are profitable on Amazon, and aggregate them and scale them. And that company took off, and to date, that's been my best investment overall. It takes one to make up for all the other ones that may be languishing or losing money in restaurants. But but there was a familiarity there. We were good friends. He was the founding CEO and board chairman of APT, so I already knew him pretty well. And at that point, he had at least one or two other exits after leaving APT. So this sounded like a good idea to me, and I knew he knew what he was doing, and it ended up being a very successful investment.
Mm-hmm. So